Okay, so we mentioned earlier whenever we were talking about how the myosin heads bind to actin and pull on them, that they burn 1 ATP every time they do that. And so muscles require a great deal of energy. And so at this point we need to talk a little bit more about energy and how muscle cells generate the energy that they need. So here in the notes packets, I just want to start off with this basic idea of why does a cell need ATP to contract, okay? And that's because ATP powers the movement of the myosin heads as they pull on actin. Okay, so what we have is we have this process called cellular respiration that is going to give a cell ATP, okay? And so just to tell you what that is, there's a thing called aerobic respiration. Let me make that a little bit bigger so you can see it. Okay, so aerobic respiration, which this requires oxygen, and what you do is you have glucose plus oxygen, and that is going to give you carbon dioxide and water and ATP. Okay, so this is what is called aerobic respiration. You start with glucose, you add in some oxygen, and you get out carbon dioxide, water, and ATP. So this is the energy that we want. One thing you need to know is that the cell can store glucose. So if this here were a glucose molecule, it turns out that the cell can take a whole bunch of glucose molecules, smush them together, and store this. This is called glycogen. Okay, so glycogen is essentially chains of glucose stored inside of cells. So glycogen, this right here, is going to be one of the main storage sources of energy. Okay, and so if a cell needs a little ATP, what they're going to do, they're going to take off a glucose molecule, and then they will run that glucose molecule, react it with oxygen, and produce carbon dioxide, water, and most importantly, ATP in that process. And then this ATP is going to be used to power the movement of those myosin heads. Okay, so let's look at this image here that shows us aerobic metabolism. Okay, and let me help explain this image here to you. Okay, so here's glycogen, which is our stored glucose. Okay, and we now need a little bit of ATP to power our muscles. So we're going to pull off a glucose molecule. We're going to basically take it and turn it into this chemical molecule called pyruvate. Okay, so we take this, we chop it into a couple of pieces, and that releases a bit of energy in the form of ATP. Pyruvate, and this process of glucose to pyruvate is called glycolysis. So if you're following along on your notes packets, here we're talking about aerobic respiration. So we start off in glycolysis. We start off with glucose, and we break it into pieces. We get 2 pyruvate molecules. And through this process, we produce 2 ATP. This is going to occur in the cytoplasm, and this step does not require oxygen. We're then going to take this pyruvate and send it to the mitochondria. So that is what's being shown right here. Pyruvate is being sent to the mitochondria. We take it through a series of steps. I'm not going to make you know those details. And pyruvate is converted into carbon dioxide. And as that happens, we are able to make 34 ATP molecules. Now notice, this requires oxygen. So this is showing a blood vessel, and it's delivering oxygen to the mitochondria to be able to get pyruvate to turn into carbon dioxide. Okay, so if you're following along with our notes, our input, our carbon input, that 2-pyruvate that we produced up here, we just take those two and we send it to the mitochondria, and in the process we produce carbon dioxide. We're going to, through that, we're going to produce about 34 ATP, and this happens in the mitochondria. And yes, it does require oxygen. Okay? So this here only happens if oxygen is present. Now, you may have been exercising or running or something like that at some point in your life. And man, you start breathing hard. You start needing to deliver more and more oxygen to those muscles because they're working so hard. They need more ATP than this. You need to keep going through this pathway. But at some point, your body can't deliver enough oxygen at a high enough rate to get this step to happen efficiently. And so you switch over to a different type of energy production that doesn't require oxygen. So the type that does is called aerobic respiration. The type that does not is called anaerobic respiration. And what triggers it? Body can't keep up with the muscles excuse me, demand for oxygen. It can't deliver enough oxygen to the muscles. So let's now look at anaerobic respiration. So we actually start off the same. We have our glycogen. We're still going to pull off a glucose molecule. And we are going to so we have glycogen, we pull off the glucose molecule, and we start off with glycolysis where we produce pyruvate. But now we have a thing after that called fermentation, where pyruvate, instead of going to the mitochondria, is turned into this molecule called lactate. Now, we don't get any energy out of that, but it's going to help this part to keep on going. Okay? So if you're following along with your notes, glycolysis and fermentation, we start off with glucose. But this time our carbon output is lactate. How much ATP is produced? Well, 2 ATP. And all of this does occur in the cytoplasm, and it does not require oxygen. So that's good, but look at the difference. 2 ATP. Up here we had 36 for each glucose that we started with. Here, man, only 2 ATP for glucose. It's not very efficient. It keeps us going, but it's not very efficient. So when there's no oxygen, muscle cells start doing something else. They have a store of what's called creatine phosphate. That's what CP stands for. And so creatine phosphate. So it's essentially creatine with a phosphate molecule stuck on it. And what's going to happen is it's going to transfer that phosphate to ADP to create ATP. So what we're seeing here, creatine phosphate, it takes its phosphate and puts it onto ADP, which is adenosine diphosphate, making it ATP. So now, if you follow along in our notes, the carbon input, creatine phosphate, carbon output is just creatine, and we end up with 1 ATP in the process. This also occurs in the cytoplasm, and it does not require oxygen. So wow, without oxygen we get much less ATP. So this asks you, does aerobic or anaerobic respiration produce more ATP? I'll let you look at the numbers in these two charts and you decide. Now there's one other thing that I want to mention while we're here, which is called the Cori cycle. And this is a series of reactions where you're going to take lactate. Remember, we had glucose, we only got 2 ATP. We're going to take lactate, and that's actually going to be put out into the bloodstream and sent to the liver. The liver will convert that lactate back into glucose, and then it will send that glucose back to the muscle cell. So it's called the Cori cycle for the name of the person who discovered it, but it is a cycle because we start with lactate in the muscle, goes to the blood, to the liver, liver changes lactate to glucose, sends it back through the blood to the muscle. And so we keep going through this cycle. Okay, and so that allows us to kind of reuse a little bit of this to keep on making ATP. Okay, so that is the Cori cycle. So your homework lesson is going to list a few more things. Excuse me. It's going to list some reasons why you get muscle fatigue, which means the muscle can no longer keep doing that level of activity. It talks about recovery after exertion or fatigue. The Cori cycle is part of that, part of replenishing your glucose and glycogen stores. And you're actually going to have an elevated respiratory rate because you have this larger demand for oxygen for a while. One thing I want to point out too is when muscles are resting, and you may have seen it up in this slide, this fatty acid shows it going from the blood into the muscle cell and to the mitochondria to make ATP. And when muscles are resting, that's often what they're going to be doing, is using your fatty acids so that they can build up these glucose stores so that they're there when you have high muscle activity. Okay, and so I believe that that is the different types of energy and energy use. And so here's some activities to help you become solid on that information.